dogs and women who were available to them on the road more appealing than being good husbands. In addition to the change in venue, unlike their previous two albums, which they had worked on with producer Flemming Rasmussen, Flemming wasn't going to be available to fit Metallica's planned schedule, a situation that seemed fine by Lars, as it meant they had a chance to work with the man who had produced his new obsession Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. You see, Lars was completely taken with the album and the new dangerous bad boys on the scene, so he wanted to work with the man who had produced the album Mike Clink. James, meanwhile, didn't offer much resistance to this idea, not because he had the same feeling towards Guns N' Roses as Lars did. In fact, he didn't seem to know what his drummer saw in them, but he was reportedly still very much feeling lost without the guiding force of Cliff Burton, and so he let Lars have his way. So Metallica would team up with Clink, which as it turns out was an interesting twist of fate, seeing as how Clink had only ever worked on pop records before Appetite. So in preparation to work with GNR, the producer had listened to a number of albums the members of the band had recommended to give him an idea of what they were looking for. Notably, the album that Slash recommended he listen to was Metallica's Ride the Lightning. As they got into the studio together, though, despite apparently not speaking out against the selection of Clink beforehand, James would not be impressed by what the producer had to offer. He especially had a hard time finding the tone he liked for his guitars. Indeed, as Metallica ran through a couple of cover songs like they normally did upon entering a studio to get everything dialed in, James just didn't seem to be feeling whatever it was Clink was trying to do, and reportedly he flipped out. Some of this was a result of Metallica having a way they were used to doing things, and Clink having a way he was used to doing things that, for James at least, were just not meshing, especially since James didn't seem all that interested in compromising because he didn't care about Guns N' Roses or the kind of tone Clink had gotten for them. The other major factor in this situation, though, Clink believes was the simple fact that Metallica, and James in particular, were already reeling from all the changes they had to deal with, the most notable of which, of course, being the death of Cliff Burton and Jason Newsted coming in to replace him. So the idea of throwing a new producer and a new way of doing things into the mix was just too much. What they really needed was something that was familiar. So it wasn't long before Lars was on the phone to Flemming to plead with them to figure out some way to rework his schedule to come and work with them. Now, Flemming had a lot of gigs booked, but he managed to carve out room for Metallica. Upon arriving and finding that they had more or less been screwing around with the guitar tone for several weeks, with little other progress to speak of, Flemming just had the band essentially start over from the beginning. Meanwhile, Lars would share with their returning producer his vision for this album. You see, he did not want to just repeat what they had done so successfully with Master of Puppets. Instead, Lars, likely inspired by his latest fascination, wanted to create the harshest, most in-your-face sounding Metallica album yet. That was their mission statement for And Justice for All, the title for this album, that they had taken from the final line of the Pledge of Allegiance as a kind of mocking mission statement for an album that was primarily focused on themes of injustice. With Hetfield noting, quote, "Lyrically, we were really into social things, watching CNN and the news all the time and realizing that other people really do kind of control your life." The result was a very angry album that focused on things like political corruption, censorship, and political witch hunts. Now, while Lars wanted to make this album unique from its predecessors, its overall structure would still see its songs follow the familiar sequence they had established with Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets. As like both of those albums, Justice starts off with a high-speed aggressive track that sets the tone for what is to come. Like Battery in the similarly themed Fight Fire with Fire, Blackened is a blisteringly fast and heavy track, a song that, like Ride the Lightning's opener, seems to reference the logical end result of the mutually assured destruction plan, as the planet is left scarred and blackened as it is consumed by a nuclear winter. Two songs that, if you listen to them back to back, really show the growth in the band. The sequence continues as the high-speed brutal opener is followed by the album's title track, which is similarly epic in scope and structure as its two predecessors. And Justice for All, the song then, very much lives up to the legacy of Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets. The thing is, while for me these songs are just as good if not better in some ways than their predecessors, there are several songs from here on out that, while fine in their own right, aren't quite as good as what else appears on those earlier efforts. I'm talking specifically about songs like Eye of the Beholder and Short as Straw, which sound like they might be a response to the PMRC and even Reaganism as a whole with the revealed Dementia line. These tracks are fine in and of themselves, but neither has ever really caught me like a number of other Metallica tracks have. Don't get me wrong, they're not necessarily bad songs, but for me they fall well below the likes of Creeping Death, For Whom the Bell Tolls, Little Messiah, and Disposable Heroes, songs that for me really fleshed out those albums. The same goes for Harvester of Sorrow, although I like it better than those aforementioned songs on this album, even if its subject matter is extremely dark. As Lars would explain, quote, "Lyrically, this song is about someone who leads a very normal life, has a wife and 3 kids, and all of a sudden one day he just snaps and starts killing the people around him." In terms of its riffs, it's a very Metallica sounding song, and with its much more mid-tempoed approach, it kind of hints at the direction they would go in for their next album. Still, it does have this really cool little dual guitar bridge part that honestly sounds more difficult than it is to play. This song is followed by Frayed Ends of Sanity, another song that I rank above Shorter Straw and Eye of the Beholder, and while I still probably wouldn't put this above the songs I mentioned off their previous albums, there are a lot of riffs going on in this song, which deals with suffering from mental illness, something that was very much a subject at the time due to the massive Reagan-era cutbacks. Now, it may sound like I'm being overly harsh or critical of some of these songs, but again, to be clear, it's not so much that I don't think they're good, as it's just that on an album that contains songs that match, if not in some cases exceed their own heights, it feels notable that the album also contains songs that, for me at least, don't reach those same heights. Which brings us to the album's instrumental, To Live Is To Die. Now, the main riff for this song actually came from Cliff Burton. It dated back to the Master of Puppets sessions, but they just couldn't find a place for it at the time. Similarly, the song's only lyrics came from a kind of short poem the bass player had written before his death that borrowed its first 2 lines from the work of German poet Paul Gerhardt. It's a mournful song that almost feels like it's their way of saying goodbye to Cliff. That being said, it lacks the elegance of its masterwork Orion. The song again is fine, it's just they had shown they were capable of better, something that I again feel is notable with the strong note the album started off with and the next 2 songs that I'm going to talk about. You see, in contrast to those tracks, one might be the best of Metallica's more power ballad type songs, as it follows the same basic formula as Fade to Black and Welcome Home Sanitarium by starting off soft and slow before going heavy. Famously, one is based on Dalton Trumbo's anti-war novel Johnny Got His Gun, which is about a patriotic all-American World War I soldier who loses his limbs and his eyesight to an artillery explosion. Trapped inside his body with no other means to communicate with the outside world, the soldier then uses his head to tap out a message in Morse code begging for death. That being said, apparently the idea for the song actually originated in discussions James and Cliff had back during the writing of Master of Puppets. Discussions about the idea of a soldier returning home having been struck blind and deaf and losing all of his limbs, so that he had no way to communicate, yet could still think the same as he always had. Now, James at the time had apparently not been aware of the novel, but when the band's manager Cliff Bernstein got wind of this idea through Lars, he sent James a copy of Johnny Got His Gun, suggesting that he read it. The novel, though, wouldn't be the only inspiration for one, as the intro of the song with the sounds of machine gun fire and explosions flowing into the softer arpeggiated guitar part was taken from the song Buried Alive by Nawabum band Venom. Meanwhile, the hardest part of the song to get nailed down was apparently the solos, with one's middle solo not being set in stone until after the band had left the studio and was on the road for the Monsters of Rock tour, a tour in which Dokken notably requested to move down the lineup in an effort to perform before Metallica, a fairly unheard of move since the higher paid acts typically take pride in going on later. However, Dokken had grown tired of going on after Metallica as they simply could not follow them. While Dokken were trying to reposition themselves into a more advantageous spot in the lineup, Kirk Hammett continued to fret over one's middle solo. He'd had a dozen or so takes on it already, and yet he still wasn't quite happy with the results. So as the rest of the band was heading from Philly to Washington, D.C., Kirk caught a flight to New York City, where he made his way to the Hit Factory Studios to try again. While he wouldn't get much sleep before their next show in the nation's capital, Kirk would finally be satisfied, feeling that he had nailed the solo at last. Which brings us to the one remaining song that I haven't talked about today, another song that I feel is among their best. A song that, like Damage Inc. on its predecessor, brings the album to a close with a high-speed, ultra-aggressive departing shot. Unlike Damage Inc., though, Dyer's Eve is intensely personal, as Hetfield more or less rails against the way his parents had raised him, specifically the way his parents, due to their Christian Science beliefs, had tried to lock James away from the outside world, and how those beliefs led his mother to not seek medical care when she was diagnosed with cancer, a choice that ultimately led to her death. Lars would summarize the song, quote, "It's basically about this kid who's been hidden from the real world by his parents the whole time he was growing up, and now that he's in the real world he can't cope with it and is contemplating suicide." Adding, without mentioning the kid is more or less James, that, quote, "It's basically a letter from the kid to his parents asking them why they didn't expose him to the real world." In all, it would take Metallica a little less than 3 months to record all of these songs. This in spite of their constant late nights partying and drinking, as when they actually got in the studio they were apparently very productive. In the end, they had created something that very much lived up to the legacy of their previous 2 albums, that are, even to this day, hailed as some of the best heavy metal records of all time. That being said, this one would have a distinctive sound to it compared to Lightning and Puppets. To begin with, Justice has an exceedingly dry mix, lacking much if any reverb. This wasn't Rasmussen's decision, however, as he insists this was the sound he had been told to give them, as again Lars wanted this to be a loud, in-your-face, aggressive-sounding record, and that's what he got. Indeed, reportedly, both Lars and James felt that Fleming had gone overboard with the reverb on Ride the Lightning, and they did not want a repeat of that album's sound. That being said, the most notable thing about And Justice for All's production is the fact that Jason Newsted's bass is effectively missing from the final mix. Yet before we get into the hows and whys that happened, first let's touch on the fact that Jason from the start wasn't really a part of the creative process, and he wasn't even allotted much time in the studio. You see, while the rest of the band took 3 months in the studio to work on the album, Jason had to knock all of his parts out in a single day, with the assistance of engineer Toby Wright, who would go on to produce albums for the likes of Alice in Chains. This was quite a big task for Newsted, considering that these songs were all quite technical, and each featured a number of different parts. Now, Jason had throughout this time been working off of demo tapes to figure out his parts, so he was then able to nail the songs fairly quickly when he finally did get in the studio. Still, though, this was a rapid and rushed pace, especially when compared to what he would do on later records, where he would take several days working on each song, in contrast to having to knock out an entire album's worth of songs in one day. Rapid turnaround or not, according to Rasmussen, quote, "I know for a fact, since I recorded it, that there's brilliant bass playing on that album." Fleming, though, was not responsible for the final mixing of the album. That more or less left the bass inaudible. Instead, he put the responsibility for that on Steve Thompson and Steve Barbiero, who mixed the album after he'd flown back home to Denmark, with Fleming suspecting that part of the issue may have been the pair only using parts captured from the up-close microphones and not the room mics. However, Thompson put the blame for the album's questionable mixing squarely on the shoulders of drummer Lars Ulrich, who he says was the one who ultimately set the levels of the instruments in the mix, settings which effectively cut out Newsted's hard work. A claim that Ulrich doesn't necessarily dispute, as he says if that's what he did not do it intentionally. Newsted, though, when he heard the album would be crushed, later saying, quote, "I was so disappointed when I heard the final mix. I basically blocked it out, like people do with shit. We were firing on all cylinders and shit was happening. I was just rolling with it and going forward. What was I going to do? Say we gotta remix it?" In other words, while he was livid, Jason, as he seemingly did throughout his time in Metallica, chose to be diplomatic and not cause a huge stir in response to basically being left off the album. Now, over the years, multiple reasons for why this happened have been presented and discussed, most prominent of which being this was just more of James and Lars hazing Jason as a part of their misplaced anger at the idea that he thought he could replace Cliff. Indeed, the pair would even be quoted in one interview about the Garage Day EP about how they felt the bass was too loud on that record, with the pair joking that the way you could tell the bass was too loud was when you could hear it, something I highly doubt either would have said had Cliff been with the band. The thing is, while their hazing and treatment of Jason lends a lot of credence to this theory, both deny that was the case, and to some extent I believe them. I don't think them cutting out Newsted's bass was a part of their hazing, at least not consciously. You see, the album from the very beginning of its construction had been all about Lars and James. They were the ones who had constructed the songs with little to no input from the others, and this would continue as they guided the mixing process, wanting to focus on Hetfield's rhythm guitar and Lars's bass drum. And in doing so, they really did not leave much, if any, space for Newsted's bass to fit in. Lars, in fact, has said over the years that Jason's bass frequencies were intruding into the range of Hetfield's guitar tone, which was super scooped at the time, meaning he had both the treble and bass frequencies cranked and the mid-range all but cut, making it so his guitars were eating into the range where the bass would normally sit, and when they got to mixing,